I can still see that day so clearly. Though nearly 20 years have passed since it happened. The sky was a washed-out grey. Not ominous but not welcoming either. As though the clouds knew something I didn't. Holding their breath in sympathy. I was only 8 years old. A child still clutching hope like a worn-out teddy bear. Clueless to what was coming. My parents had been hurried that morning. Exchanging quick glances. Muttering to each other. Voices lowered but tense. But that wasn't unusual. They were always moving. Shifting from one place to another. Packing our lives into boxes and bags. The world never feeling quite steady under my feet. This move was different, though. They didn't say where we were going or even that we were leaving. They just told me to stay quiet. To stay close. And follow along. In hindsight, maybe I should have known. Maybe there were signs, whispers I hadn't been able to interpret back then. But at 8, you don't look for omens. You don't imagine the people who are supposed to protect you could be planning to abandon you. They left me in the small, unremarkable town of Ridgeway, where we'd stopped at a rundown gas station. It was late, and the neon lights buzzed a little as they flickered overhead. I remember the sound of tires on gravel, the sound of their voices as they told me to stay put for a moment. They would be right back, they said, and like the trusting child I was, I believed them. They drove off, and I stood there, alone in that dim light, feeling the weight of their absence press down on me slowly, minute by minute, as the reality sank in. At first, I stayed close to the station, thinking I must have misunderstood, that they would be back, and this was just some odd detour. But minutes turned to hours, and the gas station attendant started to give me pitying looks. That was the moment I started to understand I was alone. In that surreal, disorienting stretch of time, I was torn between believing they would return and knowing, deep down, that they wouldn't. The thing about being abandoned is that it doesn't happen all at once. It's like being submerged underwater inch by inch. You don't realize you're drowning until it's already too late. Days passed, and I was put into the foster system. The transition from being a part of a family, however unstable, to a ward of the state was jarring. I kept replaying that night in my head, wondering if there was anything I could have done differently. Maybe if I had been quieter or less demanding. Maybe if I had shown them how much I loved them. They wouldn't have left me there, like luggage they couldn't wait to discard. But the questions led nowhere. The why didn't matter because, as much as I wanted answers, they didn't change the reality I was facing. In those early years, the memories of my parents started to blur, shifting from people with faces and voices to ghostly figures lingering in the back of my mind. I couldn't afford to keep them alive in my memory. It hurt too much. And survival demanded every ounce of strength I could muster. I spent that first year adjusting to the numbing reality of life in foster care. Every time I was shuffled to a new family, there was a strange feeling, a quiet conflict of hope and dread. It didn't take long to learn that my role in the system was simple: show up. Follow the rules. Don't cause trouble. Some families were kind enough, treating me like a guest they knew would eventually leave. Others barely noticed me, leaving me to float around like a shadow in their already cluttered lives. The faces in these homes came and went. They blurred together, much like the voices that told me not to get too comfortable. Not to ask too many questions. I was more an obligation than a child to them, and that was something I had to accept if I wanted to keep surviving. I became something of an expert in the art of being invisible. Slipping into the background with practiced ease. I got used to it. Loneliness, I learned, was a constant companion. It lingered, pressed close, refusing to leave. At some point, it became easier to embrace it than to fight it. In time, I stopped hoping my parents would come back for me. In the silence of that acceptance, I grew resilient. Some nights, as I lay in the quiet of a spare bedroom or on the floor of a crowded bunk room, I would try to recall their faces, their voices. I told myself I needed to remember them, that it was important not to let them slip away entirely. I replayed the last day over and over. That gas station, the flickering neon light, the smell of exhaust. I dissected every moment, every look exchanged between them, wondering if I had missed some clue, some indication that would have prepared me for their abandonment. But my mind always betrayed me, slipping into a fog whenever I reached for specifics. With each passing year, they faded further from memory, becoming less my parents and more distant, hollow figures from a past I could barely recognize. The years rolled on, and I grew up not with any real guidance or support but by piecing together fragments of understanding from the lives around me. I absorbed lessons from strangers, peers, and mentors who, in small ways, nudged me towards survival. There was Mr. Langley, an old high school teacher who noticed me one day in a sea of students. He saw something in me, perhaps the faint spark of curiosity or a hunger for stability, and for a time, he became my anchor. He encouraged me to think about my future, to consider college as an option. He didn't have to do that. But he did, and it became a small beacon in my life. When I turned 18, I aged out of the system. I was alone once again. But this time, it was different. I had grown accustomed to being alone, to the quiet and the freedom that came with it. With no family, no safety net, and little money, I started to piece together a life of my own. It was rough at first, filled with nights of cheap meals, cramped studio apartments, and temporary jobs. But with every challenge, I felt a growing sense of ownership over my life, a fierce pride in each small victory. That independence became my new identity. I no longer felt like the scared, abandoned kid standing alone in a gas station. I was someone who had built something from the ashes, who had defied the odds stacked against me. Each step forward was a testament to my strength, a strength I had discovered in those quiet, lonely years when no one else was there to guide me. Moving out on my own wasn't the triumphant escape it sounded like to others, it was more like a carefully constructed balancing act. One that wobbled at the slightest misstep. With my savings from a string of jobs I'd picked up in high school, I found a dingy little apartment on the edge of town, where the rent was low, and the neighbors weren't too nosy. It wasn't much, but it was mine. I worked long hours, cycling through jobs I barely cared about, waiting tables, stocking shelves, answering phones. Each shift was a reminder of the quiet, unglamorous fight I was waging to survive. There were days I thought about giving up, days I questioned the point of all this effort. But that wasn't an option for me. I couldn't fail. I'd learned a long time ago that there was no one left to pick me up if I fell. There were moments, though, when the weight of it all grew unbearable. I'd watch families passing by on the street or see parents with children, and a dull ache would creep into my chest. It wasn't just loneliness, it was something deeper, a longing for the kind of love I'd never known. But I'd learned to bury those feelings. I pushed him down because I knew dwelling on them would only make the void feel wider. Slowly, I built a life, a routine. I'd wake up, work, come home, eat, and sleep, only to wake up and do it all over again. The sameness of it was comforting in a way, a reliable rhythm that kept me grounded. I focused on practical things, saving money, paying bills, staying out of trouble. I didn't allow myself to dream too big, to hope for more than I could reasonably achieve. It was safer that way, safer to live with small, attainable goals than to risk disappointment. And then, one day, I realized something remarkable. I was surviving, not thriving, not soaring, but surviving. I'd managed to claw my way to a place of stability, a place I could call my own, even if it was humble. For the first time, I allowed myself a small, cautious hope that maybe, just maybe, I could build something worthwhile from the rubble of my past. There were people along the way who reminded me I wasn't as alone as I felt. The neighbors who sometimes offered a cup of coffee, the co-worker who'd offered to split a shift with me, and the elderly woman who ran the corner store and always seemed to slip a little extra into my bag without saying a word. They became my surrogate family, a patchwork of kindness that helped me through the days when my own strength faltered. It wasn't the life I'd imagined for myself as a child, but it was a life, and it was mine. I was 25 when I first started to feel settled, like I'd earned my place in the world, however modest it was. By then, I'd saved enough to move into a slightly better apartment, with windows that let in sunlight and a front door that didn't stick every time I tried to open it. I started taking night classes, working toward a degree, hoping that one day, I could do more than just survive. I could build a career, maybe even make a difference. The city felt smaller, less intimidating. I'd found a rhythm, a kind of peace in the life I'd carved out for myself. For the first time, I allowed myself to think about the future, to imagine what might be possible if I continued on this path. But the past has a funny way of creeping back in, especially when you think you've finally left it behind. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday, in the middle of a quiet afternoon. I was flipping through the mail, bills and advertisements mostly, when I saw an envelope with handwriting I recognized immediately, though I hadn't seen it in almost 2 decades. My heart sank as I opened it, my hands shaking slightly. The letter was from my parents. A neat, short note, as though they hadn't been absent for 19 years. As though they hadn't walked out of my life with barely a second thought. We'd like to reconnect, the note said simply, and catch up on all we missed. It was surreal. Reading those words, I felt as if I'd been punched. The pain raw and bewildering. How could they waltz back into my life so casually? As if all those years of absence had meant nothing. As if I were expected to welcome them back with open arms. Anger surged within me, but so did something else, a strange, inexplicable sadness. I couldn't make sense of it. Couldn't reconcile the storm of emotions raging inside me. I'd spent years telling myself I didn't need them, that I was better off without them. And yet, Here they were, tugging at old wounds, reopening scars I thought had long healed. But this time, I wasn't a helpless child. This time, I held the power to choose, to decide what came next. And as I held that letter in my hand, I realized I'd come to a crossroads, a decision that would shape the rest of my life. For the first time in a long time, I felt both fear and hope, and I knew that whichever path I chose, it would be mine alone. For a long time, I just sat there, staring at that letter. It seemed impossible, like a message from another life. 19 years, that's how long they'd been gone. In all that time, not a single word, not even a hint that they cared whether I was alive or dead. And then, without warning, they wanted to catch up. It was absurd, insulting, even. The anger bubbled up in me, hot and undeniable, but it was twisted up with something darker, something I didn't want to face, a quiet, stubborn yearning for them to care. I tried to ignore it, to shove it down as I had with so many other emotions over the years. But no matter what I told myself, that little flicker of hope remained. Hope that maybe they'd come back because they finally realized they'd made a mistake. That they regretted what they'd done. Maybe they wanted to explain, to apologize. But even as I considered this, I knew better. Life had taught me that people rarely changed. Whatever they had been back then, the people who had abandoned me at that gas station, they still were. I could almost feel it in their casual choice of words. As if our time apart was a minor inconvenience, a speed bump in an otherwise normal family life. The letter gnawed at me. I knew the rational thing to do would be to ignore it, throw it away, and keep moving forward. But there was another part of me, a vulnerable part, that wanted closure. I had questions that had haunted me since childhood, questions I thought I'd buried but, in reality, had only been lying dormant, waiting for this exact moment to rise up. A few days later, I found myself standing outside a small coffee shop where I'd agreed to meet them. My fingers were cold despite the warmth of the day, and my heart was pounding in my chest, the rhythm frantic and unsteady. I kept telling myself that I didn't need anything from them, that this was just a formality. I was here for answers, not for reconciliation. And yet, when they walked in, I felt that familiar ache. They looked older. Of course, my mother's face was lined, her hair streaked with gray. My father moved slowly, his once confident stride diminished to something quieter. They saw me almost immediately, and a strange expression crossed my mother's face. I couldn't tell if it was regret or something else entirely. They came over, and we exchanged awkward greetings, half-hearted hugs that felt more like an obligation than an expression of warmth. We sat down, and for a few seconds, none of us spoke. I could feel their eyes on me, studying me as if I were a stranger. Maybe I was. Finally, my father cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "You've grown up well," he said, a stiff smile tugging at his mouth. "You look stable." Stable, that was the word he chose. Not happy, not healthy, but stable. It felt like a slap, a reminder that even now, they didn't truly understand the impact of what they'd done. I took a deep breath, bracing myself. "Why did you leave me?" The question came out harsher than I'd intended, the bitterness in my voice cutting through the space between us. My mother glanced at my father, as if seeking permission to speak. "We had some difficulties," she said, choosing her words carefully. "Life was complicated, and we thought it would be better for you if we left." She said it as if I were an inconvenience they'd left behind to tidy up their lives. I clenched my fists under the table, forcing myself to stay calm. "You thought abandoning your child was what was best for me." "We didn't think of it like that," my father interjected, a note of defensiveness creeping into his voice. "You have to understand, we were going through a lot at the time. We were trying to make things work for ourselves, and we didn't think we could give you the life you deserved." Their words were hollow, flimsy excuses that only stoked the flames of my anger. For years, I'd dreamed of a moment like this, but somehow, their explanations left me feeling more empty than before. "So you just left me and thought I'd be fine?" My voice was steady, but underneath, I was shaking. "Did you ever even think about me?" My mother's face softened, but it didn't bring any comfort. "We thought about you," she said quietly. "There were times we wanted to reach out, but by then, we didn't know where you were. We thought it was too late." The absurdity of it all made me want to laugh. Too late? They'd made that decision the moment they'd driven away. But I didn't let myself laugh or cry. I sat there, staring at them, trying to reconcile the parents I'd once idolized with the people in front of me. They shifted in their seats, exchanging uneasy glances. Finally, my father leaned forward. "We'd like to make it up to you. In some way, we're in a better place now, financially and otherwise. We want to reconnect, maybe be a part of your life again." It took me a moment to fully grasp what he was saying. They wanted to step back into my life as though nothing had happened. As though they hadn't shattered every ounce of trust I'd ever had in them. And worse, they wanted something from me, something they were trying to disguise as reconciliation. I felt sick. You want something from me, don't you? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. My father looked momentarily flustered. He cleared his throat again, his fingers drumming nervously on the table. We're in a bit of a tough spot, he admitted, his voice low. We could use a little help. Financially, we thought maybe, given your situation. There it was, the truth, naked and raw. They hadn't come back because they missed me or wanted to make amends. They'd come because they needed something. The anger I'd been holding back surged forward, overwhelming any lingering hope or compassion I might have felt. I stood up, my hands trembling as I looked down at them. I spent 19 years alone because of you, I said, my voice barely concealing the rage and pain coursing through me. I built a life from nothing. I survived things you can't even imagine. And now you expect me to help you? They stared at me, stunned into silence. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for them. They looked small, defeated, but I couldn't let myself feel pity. Not after everything they'd put me through. Without another word, I turned and walked out of the coffee shop, leaving them behind just as they had once left me. I didn't look back. For weeks after that encounter, I felt unmoored. The confrontation had stirred up memories and feelings I'd worked hard to bury. Their selfishness had cut deeper than I wanted to admit, reopening old wounds I'd thought were healed. I told myself I didn't need their approval or acceptance, that I was stronger than that. But some part of me couldn't shake the hurt. I started questioning my choices, wondering if I'd made the right decision. Should I have tried to forgive them? Was I wrong for cutting them off so completely? These thoughts haunted me, gnawing at my peace. It felt like they had planted seeds of doubt in my life. Seeds that began to grow and spread, darkening every corner of my mind. But slowly, as the days passed, I found clarity. I remembered what it had taken to get here. The countless struggles, the lonely nights, the endless work that had shaped me into who I was. I hadn't needed them then, and I didn't need them now. They had chosen to walk away, and I had chosen to move forward. I couldn't let them drag me back into the darkness I'd spent my entire life trying to escape. In the end, I decided to forgive them, not for their sake, but for mine. I wouldn't let their actions define me or control my life any longer. I wasn't that scared child at the gas station anymore, and I refused to let their choices haunt me. I sent him a letter, brief and to the point, explaining my decision. I told them I had moved on, that I had built a life without them, and that I was choosing to leave the past in the past. It wasn't the reconciliation they wanted, but it was the closure I needed. Months passed, and I found myself settling back into my routine, free from the weight of my parents' reappearance. I focused on my work, my studies, and the small but meaningful connections I'd formed over the years. Life didn't feel perfect, but it felt mine, untainted by old wounds or unresolved pain. Every so often, I thought about them, wondered what had happened to them. But the hurt, the anger, even the sadness, it all started to fade, replaced by a sense of peace. I had found closure, not from them but within myself. I had freed myself from the past and found a future that was bright, open, and entirely my own. As I sat in my apartment, watching the sun set over the city, I felt a quiet satisfaction settle over me. I was at peace. Finally, I had my own story, one of survival and resilience, one that I had written alone. Looking out over the city, I felt a sense of belonging I'd never known. I wasn't waiting for anyone to save me or complete me. I had found that strength within, and it was enough. I was enough. And as I watched the last light of the day disappear, I knew that, whatever came next, I was ready.